a situation where some don't know, some know, some go to work at earlier ages, while others aren't needed to work. I'm speaking now, I'm interviewing people from rural environments, the Yakima Valley in Washington, and I've had a lot of questions about this because a large number of my respondents said that they didn't know. And reviewers have hit me really hard in the review process about that. So I had to kind of go back in my interviews and code that and look at how many of these young people really didn't know. And a large majority of my respondents really did not know and found out through school. The college goers largely found out through the college process. But for those early exiters, those who needed to go to work a lot earlier, many of them found out at 14, 15 years old when they were going to work. And many of these young people in the rural Washington going to work in the fields, right? And this is what lies before them. The second part of the question was? Talking to parents, and that's a really good question. I get that question a lot, and the question is, why don't parents tell their kids? Why don't you have this conversation?
Or maybe what conversations do they have after, right?
Sure.
Or maybe they talk, but not in those terms, because I don't think maybe it's more practical. Maybe it's like, you don't go to this line, you go to this other.
Sure.
Maybe they don't explain what this means, right?
Sure. I spoke to a young man in Florida who had been picked up and detained and was put into deportation proceedings. And he, up until his high school graduation, didn't know about his legal status, and then he ended up going to community college. And he thought when he was picked up by ICE that if he told the officer that he would be okay, he would understand, wow, this is your grade 12 average, you've done this well in school, you're going to college, okay. When I met him, I met his parents, and his parents were very, very remorseful that they had never had this conversation with him. But they believed that they had been in the country for many years and that something was going to happen with their situation, right? That their status was going to change, was going to be worked out somehow before their kids became of age where it was an issue. So a lot of parents hold on to this. I've met young people who, when they find out, feel really betrayed, leave house, run away, and live other places for a while. There's a student at UCLA that I know, and I know several others in Chicago who kind of split because they're upset. So I guess the question is that if you're a parent of kids, do you tell them at a very early age, this is the future that we're looking at? But at the same time, how do you prepare them to survive? Stay away from here, don't go there.
And inside of families that may happen more often because they're differences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Vast majority of families are mixed status. It's not appropriate to talk about undocumented families, right? We need to look at within the family those who have green cards. Some are naturalized citizens, American-born, undocumented members of families.
We're going to take one more. You can be our last one. Okay, sorry, okay, two more. That was actually one of the questions that really came up to me when I read your work.
Sure.
And one of the reasons for me, or one of the things that came to mind was, I was wondering if within the community where these students live, was there a big group of people from their same area of their native country? Because I know, for instance, in my work, my participants are originally from the Napa Valley area. And so within that community specifically, there's 3 major spending states representative in that community. And specifically, certain small bolitos or ranchos, everybody knows everything, right? And so for them, I found that they found out about their legal status pretty early on. The reason being is that their families or their neighbors or their cousins or their tios, compadres,
Sure.
going back to
Sure.
Mexico during the holidays. So then I started asking parents, well, why aren't we going to Mexico? You know, why can't I go with my cousins? And so that's kind of sort of the way that they moved on undocumented status. So that was sort of one of the things that really arose for me, especially being in the LA area. Maybe the transnational community is either larger or, you know, I wasn't sure.
It's a very good question. I intentionally sampled to get a range of people whose families came after IRCA. So after any possible IRCA legalization, and so a lot of the parents of my respondents were still undocumented. And I think that that's a critical piece of whether or not families are going back and forth, right? The question about a community context in Los Angeles, like a lot of cities or even small towns across the United States, a lot of the neighborhoods are organized around kinship ties. And so you see within communities a lot of, in order for families to survive economically, it makes sense to be grouped around a lot of people that you know and you trust. And it's a good question. It's something that I haven't thought about with relation to these students, but those who knew, and I'll stress this again, those who knew about their legal status at young ages, and I know some who, one of my respondents says that her mom always, don't go here, you're undocumented, you don't have papers. And she wrote this really, really beautiful poem about you don't have papers, about her mom telling her this. But for her, as with a lot of others, that realization of not having papers, not having status, didn't become salient, right, until it was matched up with exclusion, right? Is that it's one thing, and I think that I would not argue that young people did not know. I wouldn't argue that they didn't know that their parents didn't have status because they felt the effects of being poor and hiding and being in fear, no doubt. Their own legal status for most of their day-to-day lives, just not an issue at all. And really this process that I think that's really important looking at the life course, this process of coming of age and coming into these kinds of responsibilities really triggers that realization and triggers it in a really, in some really profound ways.
I'm actually in Indiana right now, and I'm doing similar work as well. And I think what you described as a racialization of the issue resonates really well there.
Sure.
Especially since you have a lot of communities who have never had any relationship with Latinos, and all of a sudden they have Latinos who happen to be undocumented, and they just think that everybody's undocumented.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems we had in trying to really capture the narratives of the undocumented students and non-undocumented students is that the research project almost stigmatized them. So they participated in this project, and they were undocumented or they were Latino. So what we had is a lot of resistance from students who just didn't want to be noticed, didn't want to be associated with
identified, right? Yeah.
With that said, I actually wanted to ask you more: is how do we, harness the potential of research as an advocacy tool? Because I know we get a lot of questions from the community members or even the undergrads at the university who are undocumented. They're like, okay, we're tired of telling our story. Okay, we're tired of humanizing it.
And
sure. And this backlash, like, okay, this is the top story of the month.
So
we're kind of at that point, okay, now what? And you as a researcher, what are you doing with all this information?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that this has been really important for me, and I think that my experience in community before grad school really kind of shapes a lot of these priorities for me. Is that one is that it's been really important for me to not only write for academic journals, but to produce policy-relevant research that's accessible to a broader community, right? So oftentimes in this work, what is valued and what counts is one thing, right? And so, but in order to reach a broader public, I think it's important to be able to take those findings, boil them down to something that is readable and accessible to a public, and find a vehicle through which to get the stories out. And I really think that the stories, as important as they are, need to be complemented by rigorous academic research, right? That draws connections to other marginalized groups, that identifies mechanisms, right? And that poses some very difficult questions, right? And that we need to and don't get me wrong, I think the stories are crucial. And the stories have been really crucial to this advocacy effort. But how do we take these stories, right, and mobilize some bigger arguments, right, and as academic researchers, not get caught up in this kind of policy and politics debate, right, that has framed this issue in a very, very kind of narrow way to get policy passed, right? But how do we, as researchers who have that ability to step back, to spend some time and to see a broader problem, ask some questions that can shed some light on kind of a broader policy debate and kind of push that. Thank you. And thank you all for coming out. It was really nice.